The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I turned onto the narrow path that wound through the trees like a forgotten memory. The road familiar in the way old scars are, lined with overgrown grass and half-swallowed wooden posts that once marked the entrance to something whole and warm and simple. And as I drove closer to the lake house, that quiet, anxious ache in my chest began to swell, the kind that doesn't come from pain exactly, but from returning to something that knew you before life got complicated. The car hissed as I parked. Beneath the old elm, its branches stretching low as if trying to welcome me back. And for a moment, I just sat there with my hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the chipped white porch that leaned slightly to the left, at the window, with the yellowed curtain that used to be pink with butterflies, and at the screen door with the squeaky hinge that I knew would still groan in protest when pushed open. I stepped out into the heavy afternoon heat, the air thick with pine and damp earth and something else, something sweet and musty that clung to the siding like dusted memories, and I stood still long enough for the silence to settle over my shoulders. A silence that wasn't empty but waiting, like the house had been holding its breath for years and finally saw someone it recognized. Inside, the scent hit me all at once, and it was exactly as I remembered. Old wood warmed by sun, the dry bite of faded fireplace ash, the unmistakable perfume of wool blankets that had absorbed decades of family laughter and rainstorms, and late-night stories told under dim lamps while the wind howled just beyond the glass. My suitcase thudded, softly as I set it down by the stairs, and I let my fingers trail along the edges of the banister where the varnish had long since rubbed away. Then across the wall where my childhood drawings still hung in mismatched frames, faded and curling, at the corners, each one like a message in a bottle thrown forward in time just for me to find again. From the kitchen came the clink of porcelain, and I turned to see my mother placing 2 mugs on the counter, her face flushed from the stares, her voice brisk, but warm as she explained the meeting in Chicago had turned into a full week. The car was already packed, and she'd leave before sunset if the weather held, and before I could respond, she kissed my cheek with that light, distracted affection she reserved for moments when she was already halfway out the door in her head. Goodbye was quiet, a rustle of bags and a last-minute hunt for her charger, then the slam of the trunk and the snap of her heels against the gravel, and just like that she was waving from the car, her silhouette framed by dust and summer light, leaving me on the porch with the house and the silence and everything I hadn't yet admitted to myself about why I was really here. He appeared in the doorway without a sound, tall and still, his figure outlined by the dimness of the hallway, behind him, and when our eyes met, I felt that subtle jolt in my stomach. Not because I hadn't expected him, but because he looked so exactly like the memory I had held of him that it disarmed me completely. The sun slipped below the lake, and the sky turned a deep violet, and I lingered in the kitchen longer than I needed to, rinsing dishes in slow circles just to avoid the quiet that came after answers I didn't want to give. And when I finally turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, the house creaked under my steps like it was remembering how to hold someone again. But sleep didn't come, not even after I changed into cotton and pulled the blanket up to my chin, not even after I shifted twice and turned my pillow over to the cooler side, because something about the stillness kept me awake, that strange pressure of unresolved thoughts, pressing against the inside of my chest like steam trapped under glass. And then I heard them. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving along the wood, not hurried, not heavy, just slow enough to make my heart tap harder against my ribs. And I followed the sound downstairs until I saw him sitting on the edge of the porch in a t-shirt and jeans, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a cigarette that glowed faintly in the dark. I didn't say anything at first, just stepped outside and sat beside him, the night wrapping around us like a thick wool coat, and for a long time we just sat there listening to the crickets and the slow lap of water against the shore, the smoke curling between us like a question we weren't ready to ask. When I finally spoke, my voice felt distant, like it belonged to someone else, and I told him things I hadn't said aloud in months, how the silence in my marriage was louder than arguments, how the touch that used to ground me had become a formality, and how I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of being alone or of staying. Exactly where I was. Matt didn't interrupt or offer advice, didn't shift or look away. He just let the silence settle again. And then, in a voice low and even, he said, "You don't have to explain it." And somehow those 5 words cracked something open inside me I hadn't even realized was closed. Turned to look at him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the warmth of being seen without being examined, of being listened to without being judged. And somewhere in the space between his breath and mine, something quiet and deep began to thaw. The fireflies blinked softly in the dark, flickering above the tall grass near the dock like fading stars caught just above the ground, and I found myself following the rhythm of his breathing, slow and steady, the kind of calm that doesn't come from stillness alone but from something deeper, something earned with years and weight and silence. And as we sat there side by side, I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed myself to simply exist beside another person, without performing or withholding or preparing to be misunderstood. Matt stubbed out the cigarette on the edge of the step, flicking the last ember into the gravel with practiced ease, and though he didn't look at me, I could feel the gravity of his presence as something that filled the air, not demanding or urgent, just present in a way that made my skin hum, like the closeness itself had weight, and I wanted to lean into it without knowing why. He stood slowly, not in a hurry, not making a show of it, and said something quiet about locking up before heading to bed. But even as he disappeared into the darkened hallway, the place where he had been stayed warm, as if the air remembered the shape of his absence and held it for me to consider. I didn't go up right away, just stayed there on the porch for a while longer, knees pulled to my chest, arms wrapped tight, watching the silvered tips of the lake ripple under the moonlight, and I felt the first sting of something sharp and unspoken settle beneath my ribs. Not desire exactly, not loneliness either, but a sudden awareness of everything I had muted for too long. When I finally climbed the stairs and opened the door to my room, the air inside felt cooler than it had earlier, like the house had shifted in my absence, and I stood there in the doorway for a moment, listening to the groan of floorboards as they settled into stillness, the faint ticking of the old clock, in the hallway and somewhere deeper, the echo of his words circling back to me. You don't have to explain it. Like a soft exhale brushing against the underside of my thoughts. I changed without turning on the light, moving by memory alone, sliding the cotton shirt over my shoulders and drawing the blanket around me like armor, then lay back with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling and tracing the ghost of cracks that used to look like maps when I was a child, each one leading to some imagined place far from here, far from home, far from being seen. But now, lying there with the hush of the night pressing in from all sides, I didn't want to be far from here, not really, because for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something start to shift inside me, not like falling or breaking, but like returning, like water rising slowly against the walls of something that had been dry for too long. Somewhere below me I heard a chair creak, the sound sharp and quiet at once, then a window slide shut, and I imagined Matt moving through the dark house with the ease of someone who didn't have to prove his place inside it, someone who knew how to be quiet without vanishing, how to be alone without leaving, and that image made something tighten, low in my stomach, not from fear or confusion, but from recognition. I turned onto my side and reached out to the edge of the bed where the blanket pooled like it was waiting for someone else's weight, and my fingers found the cool linen and pressed into it, slow and hesitant, the way you test the depth of still water before deciding whether or not to wade in. And though no one was there, the gesture stayed. My hand left where it was, as if my body was trying to tell the truth my voice couldn't yet find. I set the easel down slowly, brushing a few pine needles from the base before opening the wooden legs and adjusting them into place, then reached into the crate for my sketchbook and palette, fingers moving automatically, each motion comforting in its familiarity, the bristles worn and familiar in my grip, the paints half-dried from neglect, yet still willing to wake with a little warmth and patience. And as I crouched to arrange everything in reach, I felt it before I heard it, the awareness of being watched, not in an intrusive way, but like the sun itself had shifted slightly behind me. I didn't turn right away, only kept working as though nothing had changed, but my spine was alert, my breath slower, and when I finally glanced over my shoulder, there he was, barefoot on the path with a coffee cup in each hand, his shirt slightly wrinkled, hair damp, like he'd just run a hand through it without looking in the mirror. And even from a distance I could see he wasn't in a rush to interrupt whatever I was doing, but simply stood there watching, steady and unreadable. He walked closer without a word, his footsteps soft in the grass, and handed me the mug with that same quiet presence he always carried like an extra layer of clothing. And when our fingers brushed in the exchange, I didn't pull back because something about the gesture didn't ask for reaction. It only existed, warm and fleeting. And by the time I raised the cup to my lips, he had already stepped behind me, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air where his body ended and mine began. He didn't speak or move for a long while, just stood behind me as I outlined the jagged edge of the opposite shore. And though he never touched me, his gaze pressed into the space between my shoulder blades with such quiet intensity that I had to pause and breathe through the heat blooming in my lower back, where I swore I could feel it settle. When he finally bent down to adjust the back leg of the easel that I hadn't noticed was loose, our arms met just beneath the canvas, his forearm brushing mine in a line that felt drawn rather than accidental. And though neither of us flinched or pulled away, something passed between us in that small, deliberate contact, something that didn't belong to coincidence or clumsiness, but to two people who knew exactly what had just happened and chose to let it remain unnamed. He rode slowly, each pull smooth and even, his forearms flexing under tanned skin, and I sat with my legs tucked beneath me, one hand trailing lazily over the edge of the boat as the water parted beneath us like glass cut open. And at one point, I looked up to find him watching me again, not in a way that demanded anything, but in that same patient study, as if I had become something worth returning to more than once. When he said I'd grown up, the words were so casual I almost missed the way his voice changed at the end, low and threaded with something heavier, and I looked at him without smiling because I didn't want to soften the moment with a joke, didn't want to give either of us an excuse to turn away from whatever had passed quietly between his comment and the breath he held after it. The boat drifted without direction for a while, the sun overhead painting everything gold and white, and I felt the wind lift my dress again, this time against my bare skin where it mattered most. And though neither of us said anything, I knew he noticed because he paused mid-stroke, let the oars drag, and looked out over the lake with a stillness that spoke louder than movement ever could. By the time we returned to shore, my arms were freckled with sunlight and my pulse felt slower but deeper. And as I stepped out of the boat and walked barefoot up the path with the hem of my dress brushing against the tops of my knees, I felt more aware of my body than I had in months. Not because of how I looked or how he looked at me, but because, for once, I didn't feel invisible. And that realization carried all the way back to the house like a secret under my skin. By evening, the air had thickened again. Not from heat, but from the weight of unsaid things that had quietly settled between us like the low fog curling over the water, and as the sun dipped behind the treetops casting long golden streaks across the deck, Matt pulled two old folding chairs from the shed and carried them to the fire pit, with the same ease he used to lift me into the lake as a child. No questions, no hurry, just steady movements and a quiet expectation that I'd follow, which I did, barefoot and still damp from a shower, with my hair twisted into a loose knot and a blanket pulled tight around my shoulders even though the air was still warm. The fire crackled in soft rhythms that matched the beat of distant insects, and I watched as Matt crouched beside the flame, feeding it dry branches with fingers that moved like he was building something sacred. Not just a fire, but a moment. He didn't want to rush, and when he finally sat down beside me, his body angled just slightly toward mine. I could feel the tension leave his shoulders as he leaned back and stretched his legs out long across the gravel, the silence between us not awkward or uncertain, but weighted in the most delicate way. He began talking not with a story exactly, but with a description. A night storm on the coast of Oregon where the waves came in so hard they knocked the anchor loose, how the sky cracked open in pieces and the water turned black, how for a few minutes he thought the boat would flip, how he remembered the sound more than the fear, that low roar inside your own chest when everything outside of you becomes louder than thought. And though I heard every word, I found myself focusing more on his voice than the story itself. The way it slowed in places, then dropped lower, the way it wrapped around me like the night air itself. I watched his mouth as he spoke, the lines beside his eyes softening in the firelight. And when I looked away, it wasn't because I wanted to stop watching, but because something inside me had started humming and I didn't know where to put it. So I turned my face toward the lake and let my eyes trace the shifting outlines of the shore, trying to match the shape of the present moment with the blurred edges of memory that still lived somewhere in my ribs. There was a pause, longer than the others, where the fire popped and neither of us filled the space. And when he finally spoke, again, it was only to say that he missed the sound of wind in the rigging more than anything else, that sometimes silence felt too clean, too final. And I didn't respond because there was nothing I could say that would have meant more than sitting there beside him breathing the same smoke-stained air, letting his story settle inside me like ash. When the fire burned low and the stars bled into the sky without ceremony, he rose and took both our mugs back to the kitchen, and I stayed behind staring at the last curl of smoke, wrapping the blanket tighter as the night shifted around me, and when he returned, I expected him to say something about bed or the cold, but instead he stood behind me and placed one hand gently on my shoulder, not pressing or squeezing, just resting there like a pause in the shape of touch, and I sat completely still, because I didn't want the moment to end or be defined or turned into anything other than what it was. His hand stayed a second longer than necessary, and then he stepped back without a word, walking slowly toward the house. And I followed minutes later with bare feet brushing across cool wood, the door clicking softly behind me as I moved through the hallway, lit only by moonlight and memory, climbing the stairs without thinking, my mind still full of the sound of his voice and the way he had looked at the fire like it might answer a question he hadn't asked out loud. I changed slowly, folding my clothes with more care than usual, and when I slipped beneath the sheet, I lay on my side staring at the dark curve of the ceiling, feeling the warmth of my own skin where the blanket didn't reach, and in the quiet that followed, I didn't think about my husband or my phone or the life waiting for me back in the city. I thought about the way Matt had listened without interruption, about the way his presence had filled the air beside me without ever feeling heavy. My eyes moved to the space beside me on the bed, to the slight indent in the mattress that wasn't really there, but felt like it was, and without meaning to, my fingers reached out and settled on the pillow, not to hold it or touch it for comfort, but simply to acknowledge the shape of the absence that had started to take form beside me. Not painful or sad, but quiet and full, like the echo of something not yet said. I stayed that way for a long time, hand resting on cotton, heart beating slow and deep, eyes open to the dark because it felt safer than sleep, because sleep meant surrender and I wasn't ready for that yet, not when the warmth of his voice still clung to my skin like salt air. Not when I could still feel the shape of his hand resting there, a steady warmth that lingered long after the moment had passed without moving. And when I finally closed my eyes, I didn't dream of distance or escape or anything wild or ruinous. I dreamed of the weight of silence between two people sitting too close to say nothing, of the breeze lifting the edge of a dress and no one pretending not to notice, of shoulders brushing beneath a canvas and neither person pulling away, and of a moment held in the hush between breath and confession, suspended just long enough to matter. She left before I was even fully awake, her footsteps quick and light down the hall, the wheels of her suitcase bumping softly over the rug, and by the time I reached the window and looked out through the pale morning light that filtered through the thick curtain of rain, her car was already turning onto the road, the taillights glowing like embers through the mist. And though she didn't wave or slow down, I felt the quiet finality of her absence settle into the house like the weight of an unwelcome blanket, warm but suffocating. The rain had started just after dawn and never let up. Not in fits or bursts, but in a steady, relentless rhythm that blurred the trees into shadowed shapes and turned the lake into a mirror of gray and broken silver. And by late afternoon, the wind had picked up enough to rattle the windows and set the old siding creaking with each sudden gust, the glass trembling in its frame as if the house itself was trying to brace against something too vast to contain. I lit the fireplace out of instinct more than need, stacking the logs the way I remembered from childhood, one angled against another, then striking the match with careful hands as if the silence would break if I moved too fast. And when the flames finally caught and began to flicker across the room, I sat cross-legged on the floor with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the sparks rise and vanish like thoughts I couldn't hold on to long enough to name. Matt appeared from the back room without making a sound, his sweatshirt loose at the shoulders, his jeans damp at the hem, carrying the old kettle that usually lived in the pantry, and without speaking, he set it on the stovetop and clicked on the burner, but the click repeated itself twice, 3 times, then faded into nothing as he realized what I already knew. The power was out. The house gone still in that particular way it only does when electricity dies and every wall seems to exhale at once. For a few moments we stood there in the dimness, him with his hand on the stove knob and me with the blanket still pulled tight, both of us listening to the wind howl around the eaves and the soft tap of rain against the chimney brick, until finally he turned and said they used to lose power all the time during storms like this, back when his father was still around and the generator was reliable, but it hadn't worked in years, and honestly, he didn't mind the quiet. I followed, him back to the fireplace where he crouched with practiced ease, shifting the cast iron trivet to balance the kettle over the flame, and we sat there in silence, watching the steam begin to rise in slow curls, while the rest of the house faded into shadows behind us, the fire painting everything in gold and ember, its warmth reaching our faces and hands, but never quite touching the space between us that had started to feel denser by the hour. When I finally spoke, my voice came out lower than I expected, strained and uneven, and I told him I wasn't sure when it had started, only that it had crept in slowly, first in small silences over breakfast, then in nights where his hand would brush mine and I wouldn't move, but also wouldn't reach back, until eventually even the absence of touch stopped feeling strange, and I lived in a house with someone who still wore his ring, but hadn't looked me in the eye in months. I didn't mean to keep talking, but the words kept coming, like the storm outside had unlatched something in me, and I told him that when I reached for my husband in bed, it wasn't rejection I felt when he turned away, but relief, because the weight of pretending to want what we'd both stopped offering had become heavier than the loneliness itself, and when I heard the catch in my own voice, I realized I hadn't said any of it out loud before, not even to myself. Matt didn't move at first, just sat with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the flames like they were spelling out the right thing to say, and when he finally turned to look at me, there was nothing soft in his expression, only the kind of stillness that made it impossible to pretend he didn't understand every word I just said. He shifted slightly, not closer, but more open, his knees angling toward me as he leaned his arm across the edge of the hearth, and, in a voice so low I almost missed it beneath the snap of firewood, he said I deserved more than to be a ghost in my own bed. That someone who lives beside you without touching you isn't loving you quietly, they're letting you disappear. And maybe I'd convinced myself I could be satisfied with less, but he didn't believe that about me, not for a second. I sat there frozen, not from fear or shame, but from the sudden, painful clarity of being seen without disguise. And when I looked at him again, I didn't glance away, not when our eyes locked, not when the space between us seemed to shrink under the weight of our silence, not even when the first flash of lightning lit up the room in a burst of white, and the thunder followed so close it made my bones vibrate. And still, he didn't reach for me, and I didn't move either, but something passed between us that didn't need words, something heavier than confession, quieter than permission, a shared breath that hovered in the air like smoke before it sank into the space where neither of us had yet touched the other, but both of us knew we would. The thunder faded into a long, guttural echo that seemed to crawl through the walls and settle beneath the floorboards. And in the silence that followed, our breathing was the only sound that remained, quiet but unavoidably synchronized, like two chords strung taut across the same distance, vibrating with the same tension. And though I hadn't moved, my entire body felt like it had shifted forward without permission, like the pull between us had grown too strong to ignore, but not strong enough to be named aloud. Matt didn't speak, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't offer comfort like a gesture meant to close the moment, because what stretched between us wasn't sadness or pity or grief. It was clarity, sharp and bright like the storm outside, and when he leaned just slightly in my direction, not with urgency or desperation, but with the kind of deliberate control that made every inch feel earned, I found myself turning my head toward him so naturally it felt as if I had always been meant to meet him there, in the hush between lightning and breath. The kettle whistled then, high and insistent, a sharp cry that pierced the room without apology, and I started to move toward it out of instinct, half rising in a daze, but he reached for the trivet and lifted the kettle himself with a calmness that steadied me more than anything he could have said, pouring the tea into mismatched mugs without looking down, without breaking the thread between us, his hands moving slowly, carefully, as though he knew we'd both remember every detail of this night and didn't want to waste a single motion. He handed me the mug, and our fingers brushed again, warm skin against warm porcelain, and I held it between my palms without drinking, letting the heat sink into my hands while he settled back beside me on the floor, not too close but no longer distant, and the firelight flickered across his face, in waves that made him look older, softer, and somehow more permanent, like he wasn't just here now, but had always been here waiting for me to return. I took a small sip and set the mug aside, unsure of what to say or whether words would even matter anymore, because everything I needed to communicate felt lodged just beneath the surface of my skin, humming and alive. And when I exhaled slowly through my nose and glanced at him again, I didn't expect to find him already watching me, his gaze steady, open, and impossibly unreadable, except for the way it made something deep in my chest open like a window long nailed shut. He said nothing, only let the silence stretch until I was the one to fill it, And when I finally did speak, the words felt raw and uncertain. The kind of truth you say only when you know someone won't flinch. And I asked him to tell me it was wrong, to look me in the eyes and say we shouldn't be here like this, alone and lit by firelight, our knees almost touching and our breaths tangled together like a decision already made. But instead of answering, he stayed completely still. And I realized that the absence of a no was its own kind of yes. I don't know which of us moved first, whether it was the slight tilt of his shoulder or the way my knee brushed against his beneath the blanket, or if it was simply that our bodies had already decided for us. But one moment we were separate, and the next we were closing the space inch by inch, our faces aligned like magnets. And when he finally leaned in, there was no hesitation, no sharp intake of breath, just the slow, inevitable meeting of mouths in a kiss that felt like a held breath finally released. It wasn't rushed or rough or searching, but full and quiet. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answers. And as his lips moved against mine with a steadiness that made my entire body soften, I felt the warmth of his hand near mine on the blanket, not touching but ready. And in that moment, I wanted nothing more than for him to close that last inch of space between us. I leaned in deeper without realizing it, my hand finding his forearm as if drawn there by instinct, the curve of muscle beneath my fingers grounding me in the present. And when he kissed me again, slower this time, his other hand rose to hover, just above my shoulder, never landing but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin like a second heartbeat. Outside, the wind slammed against the side of the house with a sudden force that made the windows rattle and the fire hiss. But we didn't flinch, didn't pull back or speak, because the storm wasn't out there anymore. It was inside us, in the way our mouths moved together with growing certainty, in the way our breath quickened as his thumb traced the air near my jaw, not quite touching, but drawing a line I wanted to follow until it led me somewhere I couldn't return from. When we finally parted, our foreheads nearly touched, and I kept my eyes closed because I didn't want to see doubt or guilt, or the weight of consequence in his expression. But when I did open them, all I found was that same steady quiet, that same questionless acceptance. And in that moment, I knew that nothing about this was accidental, and nothing about it would be undone. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing, in the same rhythm, hearts slowing into alignment. And when I finally pulled away just enough to settle back against the blanket, my hand still brushing his, the taste of the kiss lingered like warmth in the corners of my mouth. And I knew with a quiet certainty that no matter what came next, I would never forget the exact sound of the rain on the windows when it happened, the smell of smoke, the way the light flickered behind his silhouette, or the moment I stopped feeling like someone else's and began to feel like mine again. The morning light filtered through the curtains with a quiet persistence, soft and colorless, the kind that made everything in the room appear still and untouched, though nothing truly was. And as I opened my eyes and listened to the hollow hush beyond the walls, I felt the weight of the previous night settle in layers across my skin, not heavy or regretful, but present, thick in the air like the faint scent of ash that still clung to the fabric of the blanket pulled high against my chest. I moved carefully, as if the act of standing might make the memory too loud, and when I stepped out into the hallway and followed the scent of coffee down to the kitchen, I found Matt already there, standing near the sink with his back to me, his hand resting against the counter in a way that looked casual, but the angle of his shoulder betrayed a tension he hadn't shaken yet. And though he turned when I entered, his expression was so perfectly neutral that for a moment I almost believed we could pretend nothing had happened. We spoke in fragments about the weather and the generator, about how the power might return by evening and how the forecast promised another round of wind later in the week. And as we moved around each other in the kitchen, passing plates, avoiding eye contact, sipping from mismatched mugs, I realized how sharp the silence between words had become. Not cutting exactly, but full of static, like we were both tuned slightly off the right frequency and unwilling to adjust the dial. His fingers brushed mine. When I reached for the sugar, a brief and barely there contact, yet the mug trembled slightly in my grip, the ceramic clinking against the wooden table just loud enough to make him glance sideways without speaking. And though I smiled in response, it felt like a performance, one I hadn't rehearsed, one he saw through entirely, because the truth wasn't that I was calm, but that I didn't know how to be anything else without shattering the fragile space we were trying to occupy. By midday, I packed my sketch pad and paints and walked deeper into the woods than usual, past the moss-covered stones and the bend in the trail where the wildflowers used to grow, needing distance not just from the house, but from the way his presence echoed through it. And though the trees were still and the air clean, I couldn't shake the sense that something was following me, not footsteps or eyes, but the memory of his hands near mine, of breath shared in rhythm, of a kiss that had rewritten the air around it. I found a clearing where the sun broke through the leaves in quiet patches and set up my easel without thinking, hands moving automatically as if the act of creating could drown out the thoughts pressing in from every side. But no matter how long I stared at the blank canvas, no image came because my head was too full of the way he had looked at me in the firelight, the way he hadn't needed to speak for me to understand what was being offered, or what I had already accepted. I stayed out longer than I should have, the light fading faster under the trees than near the shore, and by the time I returned, my fingertips were chilled and stained with pigment, and the house looked darker than I remembered, its windows dim, its porch silent, and for a moment I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure whether stepping back inside meant moving forward or retreating into something I could no longer deny. When I finally pushed open the door, I heard the faint sound of tools coming from the boathouse, and through the window I saw Matt bent over the side of the dock with a wrench in hand, adjusting something beneath the surface of the boat's frame with slow, measured motions that told me he wasn't really fixing anything, but working through something he didn't know how to name. And though I stood there watching him for longer than I should have, I didn't step outside, because I wasn't sure I could carry the weight of one more unspoken thing between us without losing my grip entirely. At dinner, we sat across from each other with the same small distance we had maintained that morning, our plates quiet, our conversation even quieter, and the sound of my fork against ceramic became unbearable until he finally spoke. His voice, low and even, asking if I regretted what had happened, if the kiss had left a stain on something I wanted to keep untouched. And I knew by the way he looked at me, direct, unwavering, that he was bracing for an answer he didn't want to hear. I didn't respond right away because I wasn't sure how to name the ache that had opened in my chest, the one that wasn't guilt or shame but fear, real and rising. The fear of change, of desire, of what it might mean to step over that invisible line and admit I had already crossed it. So instead, I looked at him and said the only true thing I could manage. I wasn't sorry, I was scared, and I didn't know which feeling was stronger. He didn't flinch or look away, just nodded slightly as if the confession didn't surprise him, as if he'd already felt it in the way I couldn't meet his eyes that morning, or the way I had fled into the trees like silence could protect me from what had already taken root beneath my skin. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty but full of acknowledgement, of mutual awareness that nothing we did next would be small or reversible. Later, when he brought out an old board game from the cabinet and set it on the table without a word, I laughed in surprise, not because it was funny but because it was so painfully human, and I said yes without thinking. And as we played, the tension between us softened into something warmer, something that made room for small smiles and eye contact that lasted a little longer. And though we didn't speak of the night or the kiss or the storm, we found a rhythm again, not perfect but bearable, like breath returning after too long underwater. We played for longer than either of us expected, the board between us acting like some strange kind of mediator, not separating us but giving us just enough distance to feel safe. Like if we stayed on our respective sides of the table and let the rules guide our hands, we could pretend, just for a while, that things were simple again, that there was nothing between us but the quiet scrape of wooden tiles and the familiar sounds of a house settling into night. At first, our words stayed clipped and easy, half teasing over miscounts and forgotten turns, the kind of soft banter that used to come without effort back when I was just the girl who came home in the summer, and he was just the man who made sure the dock was safe and the firewood stacked. But as the minutes stretched into something slower and heavier, I felt myself leaning into the way his voice dropped when he read each letter aloud, how his fingertips brushed the table just slightly closer to mine with every new move. Not deliberate, but not accidental either. At one point, I played a word I knew would make him laugh, something childish, something meaningless. And when his mouth curled into a grin that reached his eyes, I felt something in my chest pull tighter, not with longing, but with a kind of aching comfort. The realization that even now, even with everything unspoken pressing at the edges of the room, he could still make me feel like the world wasn't spinning as fast as I feared it was. The candle between us burned low, casting soft shadows that stretched long across the table, and when the last tile was placed and the score didn't matter, neither of us moved to clean up right away. Both of us content to sit in the slow silence that followed, not the kind that begged to be filled, but the kind that said, "I'm still here if you are." He was the one who broke it, of course. His voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. like he was speaking from somewhere further inside himself. And when he said, "If you left tomorrow, I'd understand," I felt the words land not as a goodbye, but as permission. And yet something in the way he held my gaze told me he wasn't asking me to go, only making room for the possibility that I might, because he'd already accepted the cost of feeling something that might never belong to him. I didn't answer right away because the question was too big, too rooted in everything I hadn't let myself admit. So instead, I reached for one of the tiles and ran my thumb along its edge, thinking about how many ways we hurt ourselves by staying where we don't feel seen, how often we lie in quiet rooms with someone who no longer knows our rhythms. And I realized in that moment that I didn't want to leave because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was pretending to exist beside someone. I felt present and wanted and whole. So I said it softly, without drama or explanation. The truth simple in my mouth, I'm not leaving, and the silence that followed was not tense but warm, like the room itself had taken a breath and released it slowly, settling into the new shape we had just created. He nodded once, no smile, no gesture, just that steady look he gave me when he wanted me to understand that he believed me, that he respected whatever pace I needed to take, and I found myself grateful not for the kiss we had shared, or the closeness that had flickered between us, but for the way he made it clear that none of this was a trap, that I was free to feel what I felt without being expected to rush toward it. I helped him clear the table slowly, stacking the tiles into the worn linen pouch with fingers that lingered too long on the fabric. And when he brushed past me to place the box back in the cabinet, our shoulders touched, not heavily, not pointedly, but just enough that I didn't want to move away, and he didn't either. When the last candle was blown out and the room dropped into a softer kind of darkness, I made my way upstairs with bare feet on cool wood, the silence folding around me like something familiar. And when I reached my room and closed the door, behind me, I stood there for a long moment before turning off the hallway light, letting the night take full hold of the space. As I lay down, the bed sheets cool against my legs and the pillow still faintly scented with lavender from the day before, I found myself staring at the ceiling, not in restlessness, but in thought, retracing the moments of the evening not with guilt or confusion, but with a strange and steady clarity, as if something inside me had finally stopped resisting what it had known for a while. This place, this house, this quiet space between what I'd run from and what I might be running toward, was beginning to feel like a version of peace I hadn't realized I needed. I turned to the side where the mattress still held the shape of only me and reached out in the dark without thinking, my hand resting softly on the empty space as if that gesture alone could anchor the slow shift happening inside me. And as the rain outside started again, softer now, I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of it match the weight of his last glance. The one that didn't ask for anything except truth, and maybe time. The rain had returned with a vengeance by nightfall, not the soft kind that whispers against the glass, but the violent, breathless kind that presses against the windows like it's trying to get in. And with every crack of thunder that rolled through the trees and every gust of wind that made the walls groan, I felt my body growing stiller, more alert, more aware of the way the storm outside mirrored the weight coiled tight inside me. Thick, with anticipation and the ache of a boundary I had already crossed in silence. The lights had gone out hours earlier, flickering twice before disappearing completely, and I hadn't bothered lighting the lantern, hadn't even reached for a candle, because the glow of the fireplace and the occasional electric white flash from the storm outside were enough to shape the room in fragments, shadows painted over the furniture like slow-moving ghosts. And in that flickering half-darkness I waited, not pacing, not distracting myself, only sitting upright on the bed with the sheet draped loosely across my lap, the air humid against my skin, every breath slow and measured as I listened for the sound of his footsteps. He came without knocking, as I knew he would, the door creaking. Open just wide enough for the narrow beam of his flashlight to sweep across the wooden floor in a quiet arc, and when our eyes met in the low light there was no surprise, no hesitation, just the heavy pulse of understanding that had been building between us for days. And without speaking, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch loud in the quiet, louder than the wind, louder than my breathing. He walked to the edge of the bed with the flashlight angled low, casting our shadows long and high against the far wall. And as he set it down and crouched slightly to adjust the edge of the blanket where it had slipped to the floor, I saw his hands tremble just slightly, not from fear but from the weight of restraint. And when he finally sat beside me, the mattress, dipped under his weight, and the space between us folded in half without either of us needing to reach. I turned toward him slowly, the blanket slipping slightly as I shifted, exposing just a trace of warmth where skin met air, and in the glow of the storm and the fire, I could see his throat tighten as he swallowed whatever words he might have brought with him, and for a moment we just sat like that, close enough for our knees to touch if either of us moved even slightly. But neither of us did, because the stillness was louder than movement, fuller than speech. When he reached for my hand, he didn't do it quickly, or cautiously, but with the kind of reverent certainty that said he had already imagined this exact moment 100 times before ever acting on it. And when our fingers met and curled together without effort, I felt something in my chest collapse and unfold, all at once, a silent surrender that didn't require permission, because the permission had been living in every look we hadn't turned away from all week. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady, a whisper that brushed the air between us more like a confession than a question, and when he asked if I wanted him to stay, I didn't answer with words, didn't nod or pull him closer. I just looked into his eyes until I felt my pulse slow to match his, and in that silence he found everything he needed to lean in. The kiss was nothing like the first one, nothing like the slow, searching softness of that moment by the fire. It was deeper, quieter, fuller, the kind of kiss that begins not with hunger, but with weight, with everything unsaid folded into every breath. And when his mouth met mine, I felt my entire body sink into the gravity of it, not as surrender, but as recognition. His hand tightened gently around mine as we stayed close in that moment, unhurried, present, as though the world around us had slowed to make room for what was unfolding between us that only happens when nothing is being rushed. And the warmth of his breath on my cheek, the scrape of his stubble against my skin, the way his thumb traced the curve of my knuckle as if anchoring me there. All of it made the rest of the world dissolve into the low roll of thunder and the distant tremble of windows shifting in their frames. When we finally pulled back, just barely, just enough to breathe, he rested his forehead against mine for a moment, his eyes closed, our hands still joined, and I felt the edges of my resolve begin to blur, not break but bend, folding into the quiet hunger that lived behind every inhale, and without speaking, my hand rested against his arm without thinking, the familiar weight of him beside me reminding me I wasn't alone in what I felt without weight or pressure, just presence, just the shared space of two people who had finally stepped into what had been waiting for them all along. My head turned toward him on the pillow, our arms still linked, and as I stared at the dark ceiling above us, listening to the rain hammer against the roof like a second heartbeat, I didn't think of consequences or guilt or the past. I thought only of his breath, steady and near, and the way his body mirrored mine in stillness, like we had created something outside of time, outside of rules, outside of anyone else's expectations but our own. We didn't hear the door open downstairs, didn't hear the wet shuffle of footsteps across the entryway tile, or the soft groan of tired arms adjusting a grocery bag against one hip. Because the thunder struck again just as the front door closed, a sharp, explosive sound that swallowed everything else, and by the time I registered the faintest creak of the first step, I was already turning toward the noise, the sound somehow wrong even through the storm. At first it was just a shift in air, the kind of subtle change you don't recognize until it's already too late, like a draft across the back of your neck that doesn't belong, or the quiet pause between thunder and realization. And for a second, I told myself it was nothing, that the storm outside was playing tricks with my senses, that the creak of the floorboard was old wood settling under pressure from the wind, but something in me sat up anyway, my breath catching halfway between the inhale and the truth that was rising fast in my throat. Matt had propped himself up on one elbow as well, his brow furrowed, not in panic but in focus, the way someone listens when they already know they're too late to pretend otherwise. And the space between us filled with a sudden tension that was no longer desire or hesitation, but dread, sharp, and total, because by the time we heard the second step groan and the soft rustle of a plastic bag shifting under someone's arm, we both knew exactly who it was and exactly what she had just walked into. He moved first, fast and quiet, slipping from the bed without a word, pulling the sheet halfway over me as he stood, grabbing for his flashlight in one practiced motion. While I sat frozen, heart pounding in my chest with a rhythm that didn't feel like mine, every nerve in my body stretched tight enough to snap as I listened to the slow, deliberate sound of feet climbing the stairs, and each footstep landed, like a nail into something we had barely finished building. I heard the first pause just outside the door. A moment of stillness so pure it made my skin go cold, followed by the softest intake of breath, sharp but broken at the edges, and then her voice. Not a word, not a question, but a single, instinctive sound, like a breath being stolen from the room, followed by the unmistakable thud of something slipping from her hands, a soft crumple of cardboard and the louder, brittle crash of porcelain hitting the wood in uneven shards. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all, but a void, dense and echoing, where everything inside me fell at once, the heartbeat, the memory, the illusion that we were still, alone. And in that one stretched second, I heard her hand grip the railing, her breath come shallow and fast, and then a low, aching sound that wasn't a cry, but something quieter, the kind of sound people make when their heart fails to keep up with what their eyes are seeing. Matt was already out the door before I could even speak, his footsteps loud against the stairs as he rushed down toward her, flashlight beams slicing the dark as he reached for her with hands that knew exactly where to go, and I heard her voice now, faint and wavering, calling his name not with anger, but with the brittle panic of someone whose world had shifted beneath them too fast, and then the unmistakable panic in his own tone as he said her name again and again, his voice lower, faster, trying to steady her, trying to pull her back. I stayed where I was, sheet clutched around my chest, hands trembling so hard I could barely grip the edge of the mattress, and I listened to the chaos unfolding downstairs. The crash of something being pushed aside, the scrape of shoes across the floor, his voice rising and falling in frantic bursts, and hers now silent, completely still, until the only sound I could make out was the rush of rain against the windows, and the distant, erratic beat of my own breath refusing to even out. I didn't move. Not at first. Not when I heard the front door swing open again. Not when the wind howled in and the porch creaked under the weight of hurried steps. And not even when I heard the car doors open and the engine roar to life in a surge that felt like it split the night in half. Because all I could do was sit there in that dim room with the scent of sweat and storm still hanging in the air and the shape of Matt's presence, still warm in the sheets beside me, now empty and wide and echoing with the weight of everything that had broken open. The walls pulsed with silence now, thick and breathless, and as I finally stood and walked slowly toward the hallway, the sheet wrapped tight around me like it could undo what had already been seen, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, hair loose, lips swollen, eyes wide and hollow, like someone who had been torn out of a moment and dropped into another one without warning, and I couldn't look away, because there was no part of me that didn't belong to this night anymore. Behind my eyelids, the night replayed in fragments. His hand in mine, the whisper of his question, the storm flaring behind us like a warning, and the unbearable pause between the sound of the cake hitting the floor and the world falling apart, and all I could think was that I had never meant to break anything, but I had. And now nothing would ever return to the quiet it once was. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I could only reconstruct in flashes. Matt's voice cutting through the storm as he barked something into the phone, the streaks of rain across the windshield like broken strings pulled tight across my vision, the way the emergency lights flickered across the wet gravel as the paramedics loaded her into the back of the ambulance. Their movements fast but methodical, while Matt's hand stayed firmly on her shoulder even when they asked him to step aside, and me standing on the porch wrapped in the same sheet, clutching it like it could protect me from the truth that had already unfolded, unable to move or speak or follow, because every step forward now felt like walking through a house where the floor had vanished beneath me. Now the house was silent in the way only a place touched by fear becomes. Not quiet, but stunned, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold between my palms, my fingers wrapped around the ceramic like the heat could return if I just willed it hard enough. But the cup remained heavy and lifeless, and the silence around me pressed in from every side, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the white wall that had never mattered until now. Matt hadn't come back the night it happened, hadn't texted or called or asked me to join him at the hospital, and even though I knew he had every right to be there and every reason not to think of me, I couldn't stop the way my chest clenched each time I imagined him sitting beside her, holding her hand with the same steadiness he had once offered to me, his voice low and calming, his face composed and unreadable, as if the weight of what we had done could be folded and stored behind his eyes like something practiced and permanent. I tried turning my phone on 3 times and shut it back off each time before it finished booting, the black screen returning like a decision I wasn't ready to make, Because I couldn't bear the idea of seeing messages I didn't want to answer, or silence I couldn't escape. So I left it face down on the counter and wandered through the house like a ghost in someone else's body, touching objects without remembering why, opening drawers and closing them again, pausing in doorways like I might find an answer on the other side if I stood still long enough. The hours passed in pieces after that, the house slipping into shadows again while the fire in the living room faded into nothing but ash, and I sat curled in the corner of the couch with my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the empty doorway like I expected her to appear there, with her coat still on and her hair damp from the rain, her voice sharp but forgiving, ready to tell me everything would be fine, that this was just another mistake, that we were still okay. But the truth sat heavier than that. She hadn't woken up in almost 2 full days, and though the doctors said the stroke had been minor, something they caught quickly, something she could come back from, they also said her heart had been under strain longer than anyone knew, that stress had ways of hiding until it didn't. And even though no one said it aloud, I knew what they were thinking. What Matt must have been thinking as he sat beside her in that sterile white room with machines that beeped at regular intervals while her chest rose and fell like it belonged to someone else. I didn't ask how he explained it when she first looked at him, whether he told her it meant nothing or told her the truth or said nothing at all. And I didn't ask if she spoke my name or if she looked past him with eyes that already understood what had been taken before the words were ever said, because I couldn't bear the answer, couldn't hold the image of her mouth forming my name with more pain than breath. So I sat instead in the safety of not knowing and let the weight of it bury me. The next morning came without a beginning, just the slow turn of shadows along the floor and the hollow ache in my chest that hadn't lifted since the sirens pulled away. And as the day moved on without asking me to participate, I sat in the same chair I'd sunk into the night before, unmoving, my hands resting uselessly in my lap, my thoughts circling the same sentence I hadn't dared say aloud, the one that started with her name and ended with the impossible truth that if she never opened her eyes again, it would be because of me. I stood there with my hand resting on the frame, watching the light flicker inside the old lamp on the side table as the wind made it tremble. And for a moment I imagined her walking through the door again, brushing the rain from her coat and telling me she'd forgotten something upstairs. Her voice sharp but alive, her presence loud and undeniable in the way only hers ever was. But the house stayed quiet, and the only sound was the low hum of a world that no longer included her footsteps on these stairs. I leaned my forehead against the glass, letting the coolness anchor me there, and whispered the words that had been clawing at the inside of my chest for hours. The words that felt too small and too late, but were all I had left. Please, just wake up. And though no one was there to hear it, and though I knew words could not undo what had already unraveled, I said it again, slower this time, my breath fogging the glass as I closed my eyes and imagined her voice answering back, imagined her fingers brushing mine. Imagined something I hadn't allowed myself to believe in since the moment I saw the cake hit the floor. I stayed like that long after the sun disappeared, standing still in the soft hum of a house that had lost its anchor, watching the dark creep in through the trees like fog rising off the lake, and I thought of every moment we had once shared under this roof, of every time we laughed in the kitchen or sat by the fire, or fought over nothing just to feel something, and I whispered again into the stillness, not to her or to Matt or even to myself, but to the night itself. Please, just let her come back, and then I let the silence return. Then everything went black.